Cruel cop stops black delivery driver during a storm. Then the packages reveal who he was helping. There is a particular kind of commitment that does not announce itself. It does not ask to be noticed or recorded. It shows up in the dark and the cold in the hour before the rest of the city has decided whether to move at all, and it performs the specific function it was built to perform without ceremony or complaint. It is not heroism in the cinematic sense. It is something quieter and more durable than that. It is the decision made in a cold parking lot before the sun comes up with ice on the windshield and uncertainty about the roads ahead to go anyway. To go because the route is the route, and the manifest is the manifest, and at the end of each address is a person who is depending on arrival. Dontae Ellison had made this decision many times over 11 years. He made it again on the morning of the ice storm at 5:47 in the morning in the parking lot of the Regional Logistics Depot on the west side of Millbrook, when the temperature was 19 degrees, and the freezing rain had been falling for 6 hours, and the city had already issued a Level 2 weather emergency that discouraged all non-essential travel. He sat in his personal vehicle for 3 minutes after arriving, not because he was uncertain, but because he was going through his pre-shift mental inventory, the process of bringing himself to full attention before walking into the depot and beginning the work. He had done this for 11 years. It had become as natural as breathing. He went in. He checked in with the floor supervisor. He was one of 3 drivers who had reported. 3 out of the 27 who had been scheduled that morning. The other 24 had called in or simply not appeared, and no one was criticizing them for it. The roads were genuinely dangerous. The emergency declaration covered the entire county. Staying home was the reasonable choice, and the company had made clear it would not penalize drivers who exercised it. But Dontae had looked at his manifest the night before, when the schedules were distributed, and he had seen the codes on certain packages, and he had made his decision before he went to sleep. The floor supervisor was a man named Raymond Chu, who had been working the logistics depot for 9 years. Raymond was the kind of manager who did not need to express his appreciation in elaborate ways because his appreciation expressed itself in specific practical knowledge. He knew which of his drivers were serious and which ones were performing seriousness while actually coasting. He knew Dontae. He had known him for 8 of the 11 years. When Dontae walked in that morning, Raymond looked at him, looked at the board with its mostly empty check-in columns, and said, "You saw the manifest." Dontae said, "I saw the manifest." Raymond nodded. There was nothing more to say about it. The work was the answer. The manifest for Dontae's route that morning was not a typical residential manifest. It had been compiled by the logistics coordinator Joanne Park in consultation with the County Emergency Management Office, starting at 6:30 the previous evening when the storm forecast had hardened from probable to certain. Joanne was 47 years old, and she had been coordinating regional logistics for the company for 12 years. She understood emergency logistics with the precision of someone who had done it before, not as an exercise but as a real problem with real stakes, where the difference between a package arriving and a package not arriving was not a customer service issue, but a medical one. She had gone through every package scheduled for delivery in the eastern residential zones of Millbrook and pulled out anything with a medical or pharmaceutical designation. She had cross-referenced these with the County Emergency Management Priority List, which identified homebound residents in the storm coverage area who could not travel to obtain medical supplies on their own. She had communicated with the county office that morning to confirm which drivers and which routes were authorized under the emergency declaration. She had sent written notification to the county emergency coordinator before 7 in the morning. She had documented everything. What she had placed on Dontae's manifest that morning was 16 packages total. 3 were labeled medical supplies/homebound boxes of wound care materials, mobility equipment components, and a portable blood pressure monitoring device that had been ordered through a medical supply fulfillment service. 2 were labeled RX time sensitive. These were the ones Dontae had seen the night before. These were the ones that had settled the question of whether he was going to work. The first RX package was addressed to a woman named Irene Aurelio, age 79, at a house on Millbrook's east side. It contained a 1-month supply of insulin. The package had come from a mail-order pharmacy and had been in transit for 2 days before the storm slowed processing at the distribution hub. It had a temperature indicator strip on the inner packaging, a thin adhesive label with a color-coded range that turned yellow if the package had been held above a certain temperature, and turned a cautionary amber if it had been held at the edge of the acceptable cold range for too long. The pharmacy had included standard cold packs. The strip was still in the safe zone when Dontae loaded the van. He checked it himself. The second RX package was addressed to a man named Harold Vesey, age 82, on a street 2 blocks from Mrs. Aurelio's address. It contained a blood pressure medication that had been delayed 3 days in the storm processing backlog. Mr. Vesey's daughter had called the pharmacy twice. The pharmacy had called the logistics company. The logistics company had flagged it for priority handling on the first day the roads might allow delivery. That day was today. The medication was not as acutely time-sensitive as the insulin, but 3 days without it was not nothing. Harold Vesey's daughter lived 40 minutes from his house on roads that were currently impassable. Dontae loaded the van with Raymond's help. The cargo area was not heated. In a standard delivery day, this was not a significant concern. On a day when the temperature was 19 degrees and the cargo included temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals, it was a factor that required attention and efficiency. Dontae knew this. He had done medical deliveries before under normal conditions. He understood that the insulin had a window and that the window required him to move. He placed the manifest on the dashboard, printed 1 page, itemized with the package codes and descriptions printed clearly under each address. The RX packages were at the top of the route, the 2 East Side pharmaceutical addresses first before the standard residential stops. This was standard protocol for time-sensitive items. He had arranged it himself in the sequence that made the most logistical sense. The manifest was visible from outside the van. The headings and codes were legible to anyone who looked. He pulled out of the depot at 6:24 in the morning. The roads were coated in a thin, hard layer of freezing rain that had bonded to the asphalt in the night and been refreshed by the continuing precipitation. Driving on it required a particular technique: smooth inputs, slow speed, significant following distance. The constant attention to micro-changes in the road surface that indicated variations in ice thickness or underlying conditions. Dontae drove at this work with the same methodology he brought to everything else. He did not rush. He did not need to be told to be careful. Careful was simply the correct response to the conditions, and he was already doing it. He moved through the west side of Millbrook without incident, past the closed storefronts and the empty intersections, past the few other vehicles, moving with the careful slowness that the roads required. A city maintenance truck, 2 police cruisers, 1 other delivery van from a different company moving east on a parallel street. The city was not empty, but it was muted, reduced to the essential movements of the people and machines that had decided the storm did not relieve them of their obligations. He turned onto Birchmore Avenue at 7:19. Birchmore was a residential street in the eastern section of Millbrook, wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic and lined on both sides with modest, well-kept houses that sat back from the road behind small front yards. Most of the yards were invisible under snow. Most of the houses showed no signs of activity. The street had been plowed at some point in the last several hours, but ice had reformed on the plowed surface, and the van moved down it with the deliberate caution that the surface demanded. Dontae was in the middle of the lane, moving at under 15 miles per hour, watching the road ahead and the parked cars on the right for any indication of changed surface conditions. The police cruiser was parked on the left side of the road facing east about 300 feet ahead. He saw it before it moved. When the van drew close, the cruiser's lights came on, not the emergency rack, just the headlights flashing twice the signal that means pull over. Dontae pulled over to the right side of the road, stopped the van, and put it in park. He turned on his hazard lights. He took a breath. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. The officer who got out of the cruiser and walked toward the van was a woman. She was in full cold-weather patrol gear, heavy jacket, gloves, watch cap under her uniform hat. She moved efficiently through the cold, not hurrying, but also not lingering. She reached the driver's side window, and Dontae lowered it. Her name was Officer Felicia Burrows. She was 33 years old, 6 years on the force with the Millbrook Police Department. Her patrol area included the eastern residential sections that she was currently covering under the Weather Emergency Protocol, which gave patrol officers the authority to stop and question drivers on the road to determine whether their travel was essential under the Level 2 declaration. She had used this authority twice that morning already. Both prior stops had been brief, a woman heading to a dialysis appointment with her documentation in hand, and a man who was clearly non-essential travel and who had turned around after being told to do so. Both had been straightforward. She looked at the van. White panel van logistics company markings on the side. She looked at Dontae through the window. Black man, 30s or 40s, in a heavy jacket, both hands on the steering wheel, looking at her with the flat, careful expression of someone who had been stopped before and knew the protocol. Dontae said good morning before she spoke. He said it in the tone of someone who was prepared to be cooperative and professional. He kept his hands on the wheel. Burrows said license, registration, and proof of insurance. He produced all three from where he had already retrieved them. He had pulled them out of the glove box when he pulled over before she reached the window. He handed them through the window. She looked at them. She looked at the van interior. She looked at the manifest on the dashboard. She asked him where he was going and what his purpose was. He said, "I'm making emergency deliveries for a logistics company. We have been coordinating with County Emergency Management since this morning. The manifest is on the dash. We have RX packages prescriptions for 2 homebound residents on this street and the next one over. Time-sensitive medications." She looked at the manifest through the windshield. She could see it from where she stood. It was a printed page, white paper, clearly typed, sitting in the dashboard document holder. She could see the headers, the codes, the addresses. She could see the line at the top that read RX Time Sensitive with an address on Birchmore Avenue, the address they were currently on. She told him to keep his hands where she could see them. She told him she would look at the paperwork when she was ready. He put his hands back on the wheel. She walked back to her cruiser with his license and registration. He sat with the engine running, the window still open, the cold coming in through the gap. He watched the temperature gauge on the van's climate display. He thought about the insulin in the cargo area. He thought about the temperature indicator strip. He calculated time. He did not know what Burrows was doing in the cruiser. Running his license, presumably. Checking registration. These were routine verifications that took between 2 and 5 minutes under normal circumstances. He waited. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes. He thought about the strip. He thought about Mrs. Aurelio, 79 years old, homebound, in a storm waiting for a package that was supposed to have arrived 2 days ago. He thought about the strip's color chart printed on the inner packaging insert that he had looked at in the depot before loading. He knew the acceptable cold range. He knew what 19 degrees and a closed but unheated cargo area did over time. 15 minutes. He shifted in his seat. His legs were getting cold from the open window. He rolled it up most of the way. He would lower it again when she came back. He did not get out of the van. He did not approach the cruiser. He sat in the driver's seat with his hands in his lap, watching the mirrors, watching the street, watching the slow renewal of the ice on the cleared road surface in real time. The freezing rain had not stopped. It was coming down in a fine, near-invisible curtain that caught the light of the street lamps in a particular way, not like rain exactly, more like static, like the air itself was hardening. Burrows came back at the 20-minute mark. She stood at the driver's window. She said she had some concerns about the travel. She said the Level 2 declaration gave her the authority to restrict non-essential travel. She said she could not verify that his deliveries were authorized under the emergency protocol. He said the manifest lists the packages. The RX packages are for 2 homebound residents. This is authorized delivery under the emergency declaration. The company has been in communication with County Emergency Management since before 7 this morning. She said she couldn't verify any of that without contacting his dispatcher or the emergency management office. She said he would need to wait. He said how long. She said she didn't know. It would take as long as it took. He said, I have a temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical in the cargo area. It's time-sensitive. It needs to be delivered. She told him she understood that. She told him she still needed to verify. He said the manifest is on the dashboard. It lists the package contents and addresses. I can show you the pharmacy label. She said she would look at the paperwork when she had a chance. She went back to the cruiser. He sat in the cold. 23 minutes. 25. He looked at the manifest on the dashboard. He looked at the address at the top of the page, Birchmore Avenue, the address where Mrs. Aurelio lived. He looked at the number on the houses visible from where the van was parked. He was maybe 400 feet from her door. He was 400 feet from a 79-year-old woman who needed her insulin, and he was stopped. He thought about this with the kind of careful, controlled attention that kept it from becoming something that would be unproductive. He was not unfamiliar with the experience of being stopped. He was not unfamiliar with the calculation required to be the right kind of still in these situations. Still in a way that did not give anyone a reason, still in a way that preserved his own professionalism and his own record, which was clean after 11 years and which he intended to keep that way. He was not performing patience. He was applying it deliberately as a tool. But underneath the applied patience was a specific, concrete awareness that was not abstract. The insulin had a strip. The strip had a threshold. Time was passing. At the 30-minute mark, he lowered the window and called to Burrows. She was in the cruiser. He said, Officer Burrows, I need you to contact my company's emergency logistics line. I can give you the number. This has been going on 30 minutes, and I have a time-sensitive pharmaceutical in the cargo area. She came to the window. She said she had been trying to reach dispatch. She said she had a number but had been on hold. He said, I can give you the direct emergency line. It goes to the logistics coordinator. She has been working with County Emergency Management since this morning. She can confirm everything. There was a pause. Burrows looked at him. She looked at the manifest, which she could now see more clearly through the partially open window, the printed headers and codes visible in the morning light. She said, What's the number? He gave her the number. He knew it by memory. He had the logistics coordinator's direct emergency line memorized because in 11 years of doing this work, he had needed it a handful of times, and having it memorized was the difference between a fast resolution and a slow one. She went back to the cruiser. He watched the clock. 33 minutes, 35. At 35 minutes, she got out of the cruiser with a different posture. Something had shifted. He could read it before she reached the window. She stopped at the driver's door and looked at him and said, My dispatcher confirms the logistics company was notified this morning. The emergency management authorization was issued at 7 a.m. She paused. She said, You're clear to proceed. He said, Thank you. He kept his voice level. She said she was going to need to document the stop. He said he understood. She said she was sorry for the delay. He looked at her for a moment. He said, I have a temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical that has been in an unheated cargo area for 38 minutes in 19-degree weather. I need to get moving. She stepped back from the van. He put it in drive. He drove 400 feet to the address at the top of the manifest and pulled to the curb. He put the van in park and got out and went around to the cargo doors and opened them and found the RX packages where he had placed them near the top of the load accessible. He took out the package addressed to Irene Aurelio, 1402 Birchmore Avenue, and looked at the temperature indicator strip. The strip was amber, not red. Amber. The caution zone. The zone that said the package had been at the edge of the acceptable temperature range, that it was still usable, but that the recipient should be informed, and that the pharmacist should be consulted before discarding. He had been trained to understand the difference between the caution zone and the failure zone. The insulin had not failed. but it had been pushed to the edge of its safe range by 38 minutes in a stopped van on a 19-degree street. He noted the strip color on his delivery log. He made a note that the package had been held by a police stop for 38 minutes. He would report this. He would make sure the information reached the pharmacist and Mrs. Aurelio so that she could contact her doctor. But the insulin was still in the window. He picked up the package and walked to the front door of 1402 Birchmore Avenue. He knocked. Let us begin with the morning, because the morning is where everything that matters in this story was decided, and because the morning is where Dontae Marcus Ellison had been making his decisions for 11 years. He was 39 years old. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hands that showed the work of a decade spent loading and unloading in all seasons. Not rough or damaged, but permanent, the hands of someone who has been doing something physical for a long time and has adapted to it. He wore the same cold-weather gear he wore every winter shift: insulated waterproof pants, a heavy thermal underlayer beneath his company jacket, hand warmers in both gloves. He had learned in his first 3 winters on the route that the cold was a cumulative problem, not just about the temperature at any given moment, but about the total exposure over an 8-hour shift, the way cold worked its way through layers over time, the way your body spent energy managing it that you needed for everything else. He dressed accordingly. He had not had a weather-related physical complaint in 7 years. He had grown up in Millbrook, the third of 4 children of Claudette and Raymond Ellison. His mother had been a school cafeteria manager for 22 years. His father had driven a city bus for 19 years before retiring. His family was not wealthy. They were in the specific sense that he understood the word, stable people who kept their commitments and paid their bills and showed up for the things that required showing up, and who had communicated this ethic to their children, not through lectures, but through example, which is the only way an ethic actually transmits. Raymond Ellison. Dontae's father had driven the number 7 bus for 19 years through the east and northeast corridors of Millbrook. He had driven it in rain and in heat and in snow in the mornings when the city was still waking up, and in the evenings when it was settling down, in the years when the route was full and the years when ridership dropped and people started saying the bus lines were obsolete. He had driven it because people needed to get to work and to medical appointments and to the grocery store, and the bus was how they got there, and driving the bus was the thing he had committed to do. When he retired after 19 years and 0 at-fault incidents and a record of on-time arrival that the transit authority's own supervisor mentioned at the retirement luncheon, he had said only, "You do the job right or you don't do it at all." Dontae had been 22 years old when his father said that. He had been paying attention. Claudette Ellison had fed hundreds of children each school day for 22 years. She had managed the cafeteria at Millbrook East Middle School with the precision and care of someone who understood that for some of the children who came through her line, the school lunch was the most reliable meal they would have that day. She had known which children those were. She had not made a public performance of the extra portions or the additional items that appeared on certain trays, but the children knew, and their parents knew, and the teachers who watched knew. She had done this as part of the job, not as a separate act of charity, because she understood the job to include the responsibility of understanding who was in front of her and what they needed. Dontae had grown up watching his mother do this. He had absorbed it without being told to. Dontae had not gone to college. He had taken some community college courses in the year after high school while working part-time and had found himself pulled toward the practical rather than the academic. He was good with logistics, with routes, with the spatial and temporal puzzle of getting things from one place to another efficiently and reliably. He had found his way to the regional logistics company through a friend of his father's at age 28 after several years of other jobs, and had discovered in the work something he had not expected a vocation. Not in the elevated sense, not in the sense that required anyone else to validate it. In the private sense, the sense of finding a shape of work that fit the shape of your particular abilities and temperament. He was good at this job. He knew he was good at it. He had been good at it for 11 years without interruption, without accident, without a significant complaint from a recipient in over a decade of deliveries. He knew his routes the way a person knows a neighborhood they have driven through in every season and condition. He knew which intersections flooded in a hard rain. He knew which streets had surface issues that didn't show on the city's maintenance maps. He knew which hills were the first to ice over and the last to clear. He knew the east side of Millbrook's residential grid with the specific practical knowledge of someone who had navigated it in darkness and heat and cold and rain for 11 years, and who had paid attention every time. This knowledge was not abstract. It expressed itself in small daily decisions, route choices, timing adjustments, approach, angles for parallel parking on narrow streets that made him faster and more reliable than drivers who were navigating the same streets from memory alone. He knew, for instance, that Birchmore Avenue had a crossfall on its east end that created a subtle lean to the right on vehicles driving east, and that in icy conditions this lean became relevant to lane positioning. He knew to compensate for it. He had known this for 6 years, since the first winter after he was assigned the East Side residential route. It was the kind of thing you did not know until you had been there, and once you knew it, it was part of you. He had read the manifest the night before because he always read the manifest the night before. This was his practice to review what was coming the next day, to understand the shape of the route, to identify anything that required special attention or preparation. Most nights this review produced nothing unusual. The manifest was what it was, a list of addresses and package types, a logistical puzzle with a standard solution. He would read it, note the route sequence, and go to sleep with the day already organized in his mind. The night before the ice storm, the manifest had produced something he did not see on a standard night: the RX codes. 2 packages, both marked RX time sensitive, both going to East Side residential addresses. He had seen RX packages before, but not 2 on the same manifest, and not on a night when a storm was coming that was going to make delivery more difficult than usual. He had looked at the addresses. He had looked at the package notes, which included the pharmacy designation and a brief handling note. He had looked at the storm forecast, which said temperatures would be in the upper teens to low 20s throughout the next day, with continued precipitation. He had thought about this for maybe 5 minutes. Then he had set his alarm for 4:45 and gone to sleep. He was one of 3 drivers who showed up. The other 2 were a woman named Sandra Whitfield, who covered the north side of Millbrook, and a man named Antonio Ferris, who covered the commercial district and the major arterials. Sandra and Antonio were also serious people. Dontae had worked alongside both of them for years. He was not surprised to see them when he walked into the depot. He would have been more surprised if they hadn't been there. Sandra Whitfield had a route that included 3 assisted living facilities and a cluster of senior residential buildings in the north end of Millbrook. She knew without needing to check that her manifest on a storm day was going to include packages those residents could not pick up themselves and could not send anyone out for. She had driven to the depot that morning in the same quiet, deliberate way she did everything. She was 44 years old, and she had been driving the North Side route for 8 years. She did not talk much about why she showed up. The showing up was the statement. Antonio Ferris had a different calculation. His route covered the commercial district and the main arterial corridors, and on a storm day his route was not medically urgent in the same way. But he had come in because Raymond Chu had texted the driver pool the night before and said he needed anyone who could, and Antonio had read that text and thought, if Raymond needs to text us, it's not a light day. He had driven in from across town on roads that he later described with characteristic understatement as interesting. He had been in the depot break room making coffee when Dontae arrived. Raymond Chu had been at the depot since 4 in the morning. He had been on the phone with Joanne Park since the night before, coordinating the reduced operation plan for the storm day. Joanne worked from the logistics company's regional coordination center, which was a separate facility. She was not on site at the depot, but was connected to it through the company's operations system and by direct phone line. She had been in contact with the County Emergency Management Office beginning the previous evening when the storm was confirmed, and had continued that contact through the night and into the morning. The County Emergency Management Coordinator was a woman named Diane Foss, who had been in the role for 3 years and who understood from both training and experience that a declared weather emergency did not mean the city stopped needing things. It meant the city needed certain things more urgently than usual, and that the logistical infrastructure for delivering those things became more critical, not less. She had worked with Joanne Park on 2 prior emergency situations, a summer flood event and an extended power outage, and the working relationship was established and functional. When Joanne called the night before, Diane had understood immediately what was needed. The authorization process for emergency medical deliveries under the Level 2 declaration was handled at the county level and communicated to the Millbrook Police Department through the city's Emergency Operations Coordinator. This communication had gone out at 7 in the morning before Dontae's van left the depot and had designated specific delivery vehicles from specific logistics companies as authorized to travel under the emergency declaration. The notification had gone to the police department's dispatch center, which was responsible for relaying it to patrol officers. It had been documented. It was in the system. What it had not done for reasons that were never fully explained in the subsequent investigation, and that may have amounted to a single missed relay in the morning briefing, was reach Officer Felicia Burrows on her East Side patrol route. She had begun her shift at 6 in the morning. She had received the general Level 2 protocols and the authority to question non-essential travelers. She had not received, or had not retained, or had not been told the specific notification about authorized medical delivery vehicles from the logistics companies coordinating with emergency management. This gap would matter. It would matter for 38 minutes in a specific and measurable way in the temperature of a cargo area, in the color of a strip, in the calculations of a driver sitting still when he needed to be moving. Burrows had joined the Millbrook Police Department 6 years ago at age 27. She was a careful officer in most respects. She wrote detailed reports, she followed procedure, she had an unusually low incidence of use of force complaints for her tenure. She was not by any objective measure a reckless officer. She was an officer who, on this particular morning, was operating on incomplete information while exercising an authority that was real and legitimate, and who was doing so in a way that had consequences she was not tracking because she did not know about the temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical in the cargo area of the van she had stopped. She did not know about Mrs. Aurelio. She did not know about the insulin. She did not know about the temperature indicator strip or what the caution zone meant. She knew about a white delivery van that had been moving slowly on a residential street during a weather emergency, and she knew that under Level 2 protocols, she had the authority to stop it and verify the purpose of travel. She exercised that authority. She was certain enough in this exercise that she did not feel the urgency that Dontae was feeling because she did not have the same information. This is not an exoneration. The manifest was on the dashboard. Dontae pointed to it. She told him she would look at it when she was ready. He told her at the 10-minute mark that he had a time-sensitive pharmaceutical in the cargo. She acknowledged it and continued the delay. At the 20-minute mark, she was still in the cruiser. At the 30-minute mark, he had to ask a third time with specific urgency and offer her the direct emergency line number himself before she made the call that took 2 minutes to resolve what 35 minutes of waiting had not. What those 2 minutes revealed was the size of the gap between what the officer had assumed and what the record actually showed. 2 minutes. That was the difference between uncertainty and confirmation, between a white delivery van stopped on an icy street and a specifically authorized medical vehicle whose driver had been cleared and documented before he left the depot. 2 minutes, and Burrows would have known. She had had 35 minutes in the cruiser before she made the call. She had looked at her dispatch system. She had the company's main number. The main number had put her on hold. She had not asked Dontae for the direct line until he offered it. He offered it because it was the third time he had raised the urgency and because he was watching the clock and calculating the strip. The manifest had been on the dashboard when she first reached the window. She had seen it. She had told him she would look at it when she was ready. She had not been ready for 35 minutes. This was the specific documented sequence of what happened. It was in Dontae's incident account. It was in the GPS log. It was in the company's call records, which showed the time of the call to the main dispatch number and the time of the call to Joanne Park's direct emergency line. The record was complete and consistent. The call to Joanne Park was answered on the second ring. Joanne Park was at her coordination desk at the regional center where she had been since 5 that morning. She had her documentation open in front of her, the emergency management authorization, the company's driver, and route notifications, the communication logs from the county office. She had been monitoring the status of her 3 deployed drivers through the company's GPS tracking system, which showed the position and status of each vehicle. She had been watching Dontae's van sitting on Birchmore Avenue for over 30 minutes, and she had been trying to reach his phone, which he had not answered. For reasons that were straightforward, he had not answered because the officer had told him to keep his hands visible and stay in the vehicle, and he had followed that instruction. When the call came from the Millbrook Police Department number, she answered it with the company's emergency protocol greeting. The officer on the other end identified herself as Officer Burrows and said she had a delivery driver stopped on Birchmore Avenue and needed to verify his authorization. Joanne said yes. She said his name, his driver ID number, his route designation, and his manifest code without being asked. She said the company had been in communication with the County Emergency Management Office since 6:30 the previous evening. She said the authorization for medical delivery vehicles under the Level 2 declaration had been transmitted to the Millbrook Police Department at 7 that morning. She said the driver had 2 RX packages for homebound residents on the east side, one of them containing temperature-sensitive medication, and that the driver had been authorized and cleared before he left the depot. Burrows was quiet for a moment. Joanne said, "Is the driver being held?" Burrows said yes. Joanne said, "For how long?" There was a pause. Burrows said approximately 35 minutes. Joanne said he has insulin in the cargo area. It has a temperature threshold. He needs to be released immediately. Burrows said understood. She said she would release him. She walked to the van. She told him he was clear to proceed. She told him she was sorry for the delay. He was moving before she finished the sentence. Not recklessly, never recklessly, because the road surface had not changed and the mission had not changed, and arriving intact was still the precondition for everything else. But with purpose. With the contained, efficient movement of someone who knows exactly where they are going and why, and who has just been given back the minutes they needed. He drove to 1402 Birchmore Avenue and walked to the door with the package in both hands, and he knocked. He had driven 400 feet. He had been sitting 400 feet from this door for 38 minutes. He did not allow himself to calculate what was different about the package now versus what it would have been if he had pulled up 38 minutes earlier, because that calculation had no useful application. The strip was amber. The insulin was still within the window. The door was in front of him. He knocked. The door opened within 30 seconds of his knock. This meant she had been near it, maybe watching for him. Mrs. Aurelio was a small woman. She was 79 years old, and the storm had compressed her world to the dimensions of her house. She had not been outside in 4 days. She was wearing a heavy cardigan over a flannel shirt and wool socks, and she had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead from whatever she had been doing before she heard the knock. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something, and has been trying not to let the waiting become worry, and who is now experiencing the specific relief of being wrong about the worry. She said, "I was worried you weren't coming." He said, "I was always coming." She looked at him. She looked at the package. She held out her hands and he placed it in them. He said, "Ma'am, I need to let you know that the package was held in cold conditions for about 38 minutes. The temperature strip on the inner packaging has moved into the caution zone. The medication is still within the usable window, but I'd recommend you contact your pharmacist or your doctor's office to let them know so they can tell you whether to use it or whether they want to arrange a replacement. She was looking at him the way people look at someone when they are paying attention to more than the words. She nodded slowly. She said she would call her doctor. She said, "Did something happen?" He said, "I was stopped for a while. Everything is fine now, but I wanted you to know about the strip." She said, "You drove out here in this storm to bring me this?" He said it was my route. She looked at him for another moment. She said, "Will you come in out of the cold?" He said he had more stops, that he had a second patient a few blocks away, that he needed to keep moving. She said she understood. She said thank you. She said it simply, without embellishment, in the way of someone who means it at whatever depth the word can reach. He said, "You take care." He turned and walked back to the van. He drove 2 blocks to Harold Vesey's address. Mr. Vesey's daughter answered the door. She had arrived an hour earlier, having made the 40-minute drive on dangerous roads, because she had been unable to reach her father by phone that morning and had decided that uncertainty was worse than the risk of the road. She had been at her father's house, the two of them together, when Dontae knocked. Harold Vesey himself came to the door behind his daughter, a tall man with white hair who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing some physical difficulty, but who was clearly not incapacitated. He saw the package. He saw the logistics company jacket. He said, "There he is." He said it as if he had been expecting Dontae, specifically as if the two of them had an appointment. Dontae handed the blood pressure medication to Mr. Vesey's daughter. He noted the package details on his log. He told her what he had told Mrs. Aurelio, to contact the prescribing physician and the pharmacy about the delay and any questions about the medication's condition. She said she already had a call in to the doctor. She said, "I don't know how to thank you for coming out today." He said, "Do you need anything else before I go?" She looked at her father. Harold Vesey said, "Son, you've done your job. You get to the rest of your route." He did. He completed all 16 stops, including the 3 medical supply packages for homebound residents, without additional incident. The roads remained dangerous throughout the morning. He drove every mile of the route with the same methodical care he had applied to the first miles. He was back at the depot by 2:30 in the afternoon, 9 hours and 6 minutes after he had left it. He turned in his manifest and his delivery log, including the notation about the 38-minute stop and the temperature strip, and he sat down in the break room with a cup of coffee and felt the specific particular exhaustion of a day that had required more than physical effort. The other 2 drivers were already back. Sandra Whitfield had returned an hour earlier. She was still in her jacket, sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a paper cup, not quite ready to peel off the cold gear. She looked at Dontae when he came in and said, "How was the east side?" He said, "Held up for a bit." She looked at him. She understood what that meant in the context of driving a marked medical delivery vehicle in a city under emergency declaration, in the way that a person who has been in similar situations understands what certain phrases mean without needing the full explanation. She nodded. She said, "Packages get there." He said, "All 16. She said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Raymond Chu came and sat across from him. Raymond said, "How was it Dontae said got held up?" "Cop stop on Birchmore, 38 minutes. Raymond said Joanne told me. Dontae said the strip went amber. The insulin's in the caution zone. I documented it. Raymond said she's already on the phone with the pharmacy." There was a pause. Raymond said, "You okay?" Dontae thought about this. He said, "I'm okay. I delivered everything." Raymond said, "Yeah." He said, "I know. But I'm asking if you're okay." Dontae looked at the coffee in his hands. He said it was 38 minutes in the cold, while a 79-year-old woman was waiting for her insulin, in an ice storm. After I showed the officer the manifest before she even asked me for my license. He said this without heat, as a statement of fact. Raymond let it sit there for a moment, which was the right response because there was nothing to add to it that would improve it. Dontae drank his coffee. He said, "I want to make sure there's a record of this, a formal record. I want to make sure what happened to those packages because of that delay is documented somewhere that the company and the county both have access to." Raymond said it already is. He said Joanne is handling it from her end. The delivery log is already filed. "What do you want to do on your end?" Dontae said, "I want to file a formal account. Just what happened. The timeline." Raymond said, "I'll get you the form." He filed the account that afternoon, sitting in the break room with a pen and the company's incident documentation form, writing in the careful, specific language of someone who understood that the value of a record is in its precision. He wrote the time of the stop, the time of each exchange, the time of Joanne Park's call, and the time of his release. He wrote what he had said and what Officer Burrows had said. He wrote the temperature strip notation. He wrote the status of both RX packages at delivery. He signed it. Then he drove home. The ice was still coming down. He drove carefully as he always did. The temperature outside the depot had dropped back below 20 by the time Dontae drove home that afternoon. The roads had developed a new layer of freezing rain over the packed ice, and he drove with the same care going home that he had maintained all day. He did not think about the stop in the way that a person might replay an injustice, cycling it for fuel. He thought about it the way he thought about operational problems. What had happened? What the consequences had been? What the record needed to reflect? What needed to change? He thought about the strip. He thought about Joanne Park, who had watched his van sitting motionless on the GPS map for over 30 minutes and had been trying to reach him while he sat with his hands in his lap following the instruction to stay in the vehicle. He thought about what it had cost to be the right kind of still for 38 minutes and whether he had any objection to having paid that cost. He did not. He had paid it because the alternative doing something that gave anyone a reason. Doing something that resulted in him not delivering the insulin was not acceptable. The whole point was the delivery. Everything else was secondary to the delivery. He had held on to that, and the holding had worked, and the delivery had happened. He had driven home. The company's formal complaint was filed the following week once the storm had cleared and the roads were passable, and the various documentation threads had been compiled into a coherent record. The complaint went to the Millbrook Police Department and to the County Emergency Management Office, and at Joanne Park's insistence to the city's Office of Professional Standards. The complaint was factual and specific. It included the emergency authorization documentation, the communication logs, the 7 a.m. notification that had been transmitted to the police department's dispatch center, and the company's GPS records, showing the van's stationary position on Birchmore Avenue for 38 minutes. It included the delivery log with the temperature strip notation and the pharmacist's subsequent assessment of the insulin, which confirmed that the medication was within the usable temperature range, but had been held at the edge of acceptable conditions and would require monitoring. It included the timeline of Dontae's attempts to communicate the urgency of the situation to Officer Burrows and the time elapsed before the call to Joanne Park was made. It did not include editorializing. It did not need to. The timeline was the argument. The gap between the manifest being visible on the dashboard and the officer looking at it, and the 35 minutes that passed before the verifying call that took 2 minutes to complete, was the argument. The amber strip was the argument. Joanne Park had insisted on filing it. Not because she was a combative person, she was not, but because she understood with the clarity of someone who had spent 12 years in logistics that a problem which is not documented does not produce a solution. The protocol gap that had allowed Burrows to be operating without knowledge of the authorization was a gap that would exist for every subsequent declared emergency, unless someone named it and demanded it be addressed. The complaint was the naming. The record was the instrument. She had assembled it with the same care she brought to the emergency manifests, complete, specific, sourced, and legible to anyone who needed to use it. She had also sat with Dontae by phone the night before filing, going through the incident account he had written, not to change it, but to ensure that the timeline in the complaint matched the timeline in his account exactly. The two documents needed to be consistent because they were being filed to different agencies and would be reviewed by different people, and inconsistency would be used to complicate the record. There was no inconsistency. His account and the company's documentation told the same story because the same story had happened to both of them. The GPS record corroborated the time on the clock. The call logs corroborated the GPS. The pharmacist's assessment corroborated the delivery log. The record was complete. The investigation by the Office of Professional Standards was thorough and took 3 weeks. The investigators reviewed Burrows' account of the stop, which was consistent with the company's timeline and all material facts, but framed the delay as reasonable, given her uncertainty about the authorization. They reviewed the dispatch records and found the confirmation that the 7 a.m. notification had been sent to the police department's dispatch center. They interviewed the dispatch supervisor who confirmed the notification existed in the system. They were unable to determine with certainty whether the notification had been included in Burrows' morning briefing, because the morning briefing was not recorded and the briefing officer did not have a specific memory of which elements had been covered and which had been passed over in the compressed time of a weather emergency changeover. This uncertainty was noted in the investigation report. The report concluded that Officer Burrows had exercised her authority under the Level 2 declaration, but had done so with insufficient diligence in verifying the authorization before and during the stop. It found that a 38-minute hold of a clearly marked medical delivery vehicle in 19-degree weather without verifying the visible manifest documentation or making the verifying call in a timely fashion represented a failure to exercise reasonable professional judgment. It found that the delay had resulted in measurable impact on a temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical. Officer Burrows received a formal reprimand. The reprimand was entered into her personnel file. It required her to complete additional training on emergency management protocols and on the handling of documented medical and emergency essential travel situations. She was also required to write a formal response to the complaint, which she did. Her response acknowledged the delay and acknowledged that the call to the logistics coordinator should have been made earlier. It did not use the word apology, but its tone was not defensive. The County Emergency Management Office issued a protocol clarification within 2 weeks of the incident. The clarification addressed the communication gap between emergency management authorization notifications and patrol officer briefings during declared emergency events. It established a new requirement for written notification to be made available on individual patrol officers' mobile data terminals, supplementing any verbal briefing when emergency travel authorizations were in effect. The clarification was named in the county's internal documentation after the specific incident that had prompted it, identified by route number and date, which any reader familiar with the events would recognize. The protocol change was practical and immediate. It would not undo 38 minutes on Birchmore Avenue, but it would, in subsequent declared emergencies, mean that an officer stopping a delivery vehicle would be able to pull up the authorization on their terminal before making a judgment call. That was something. It was a small thing in the face of what had happened, but it was a concrete and permanent change in how the system operated, and in these kinds of situations, the concrete and permanent matters. Joanne Park gave a brief statement to the local newspaper's reporter who had called the logistics company after receiving a tip about the incident. She confirmed the basic facts: the emergency authorization, the medical delivery manifest, the stop, the delay, the amber strip. She said the company's drivers who had reported to work during the ice storm had done so because they understood that their deliveries included time-sensitive medical supplies for residents who had no alternative means of obtaining them. She said she was grateful that both RX packages had been delivered within the usable window. She did not say Dontae's name in the statement, She had asked him if he minded being identified in the news coverage, and he had said he would rather the story be about the deliveries and the patients than about him. She had respected that. The newspaper story, which ran 4 days after the storm, was headlined, "3 drivers show up during ice storm to deliver medical supplies to homebound residents." It mentioned the stop and the delay in the 4th paragraph as context for the protocol change. It mentioned the amber strip and the pharmacist's assessment. It did not include Dontae's name. The newspaper reporter who had called the company was a woman in her mid-30s named Alicia Morton, who covered city services and local government for the Millbrook Courier. She had received the tip from a source in the county emergency management office, someone who had seen the protocol clarification and understood what had prompted it. She had called Joanne first, then the county, then the police department's public information office. The public information officer had confirmed that an officer had been reprimanded in connection with the incident and that the reprimand was a matter of public record. She had been professional about it. The story was not dramatic because the record was not dramatic. It was factual and specific, and the facts spoke clearly enough. He read the article at his kitchen table with his morning coffee on a morning when the roads were clear and the temperature had risen back above freezing for the first time in 5 days. He read it once. He set it down. He thought about it for a while. He thought about what it contained and what it did not contain. It contained the medical deliveries. It contained the protocol change. It mentioned the stop and the delay in the same factual measured language that he had used in his incident report. It did not contain the specific texture of what 38 minutes on that street had felt like, which was sitting in a cold van 400 feet from a 79-year-old woman who needed medication, watching the time pass, understanding that the time was not just abstract inconvenience, but was a direct cost being paid by a specific person who had nothing to do with any of the decisions being made about whether to let the van continue. He did not expect a newspaper article to contain that texture. He understood that was not what newspaper articles were for. He had filed his formal incident account. The record existed. The protocol had changed. The medications had been delivered. He thought about his father's bus. 19 years of routes in all conditions, 0 at-fault incidents. He thought about whether his father had ever been stopped in a way that had nothing to do with what he was doing wrong and everything to do with who was behind the wheel. He thought he probably had. He thought about what his father had done with that, had absorbed it, had documented it, when documentation was possible, had driven the route the next day. His father had driven the route every day for 19 years. The route was the answer. Dontae had his route. He had his manifest. He had 11 years of showing up in 16 packages on the worst morning of the winter, and a strip that went amber but not red, and a door that opened in 30 seconds, and a woman who had been waiting. He had, I was always coming. He had the particular pride, not a loud pride, not a pride that required an audience of a man who had been tested in the specific way his work could test him, and had come through it with the work completed and the record intact. He went to work. There is a category of professional dignity that does not require external validation to sustain itself. It is the dignity of competence, of accumulated reliable performance, of showing up 11 years in a row for the thing the job requires. It is not diminished by the incidents that challenge it. It absorbs them, documents them, files the formal account, and goes to work the next morning with the same intention and the same standard that it has always held. There is also a specific kind of indignity in being stopped while you are doing the right thing. Not the generalized indignity of prejudice, though that was present, too present in the particular weight of being a black man in a delivery van on an icy residential street while a white officer decided she would look at his paperwork when she was ready. That weight was real. It would be dishonest to describe the stop as something that could have happened to anyone in identical fashion, because the pattern of who gets stopped and under what assumptions is not a pattern that applies equally across all drivers. Dontae knew this. He had known it since before he had a route. He had incorporated this knowledge into his professional practice the way his father had incorporated it into his bus driving as a variable to be managed, a condition to be navigated, a cost to be paid without letting the payment become the story. The story was the delivery. The story was always the delivery. Dontae Marcus Ellison had been working his route for 11 years. He knew the east side of Millbrook in its every seasonal variation. Summer routes with the sun still up at the end of his shift fall. Routes through the leaf-covered streets. Winter routes through snow and cold and ice. Spring routes through the particular combination of wet pavement and fading light that came in late March. He had driven these streets in bad weather before. He had driven them in conditions that had made other drivers stay home. He had done this not because he was performing courage or demanding recognition, but because the route was the route and the manifest was the manifest, and the people at the end of the addresses were people who were counting on arrival. He had read enough manifests over 11 years to understand what the codes meant in human terms. An RX designation was not an abstraction. It was a 62-year-old man who had missed a week of dialysis prep medications because his pharmacy had run out and the reorder had been delayed in transit. It was a 44-year-old woman managing a chronic illness who was tracking her refill dates on a calendar because running out had consequences. It was Mrs. Aurelio, 79, homebound in a storm, managing her insulin on a schedule that her doctor had calibrated to the specifics of her physiology and her daily life, a schedule that did not accommodate gaps the way a healthy body might. He knew what the codes meant because he had paid attention over 11 years to the patterns in the manifests and to the occasional conversations at the doorstep that gave the addresses human substance. He had not sought these conversations out, but he had not avoided them either. He had listened when people wanted to talk. He had delivered to enough East Side residential addresses long enough that he was a recognized presence in certain households, not a friend exactly, but something in that direction. The man who always got there on time, the man who knocked the right way with the flat of his hand and 2 clear raps the way his father had taught him because it projected straightforwardness without aggression. He had delivered to an address on Tilden Street 2 years back where an older man had been waiting for a package of compression garments for his legs. The man had come to the door slowly using a cane and had apologized for the time it took him to get there. Dontae had said, "Take your time." The man had looked at him and said, "You know, most days I just wait and listen for the truck, and when I hear it stop, I know something good is coming." He had said it simply as a fact about his days. Dontae had held on to that. He had thought about it on subsequent routes. He thought about what it meant that the sound of his truck stopping was a sound that some people associated with something good arriving in their day. He thought about what it obligated him to. It obligated him to accuracy, to on-time arrival, to the correct package at the correct address handled with the care the contents required. It obligated him to knock the right way. It obligated him to show up on the days when showing up was difficult because those were the days when the dependency was most acute and the arrival most necessary. He understood his job through the accumulation of these moments as a form of care, not sentimental care, not care that required anything other than competence and reliability, but care nonetheless. The kind of care that expressed itself in presence, in the sound of a truck stopping. He had knocked that way on Mrs. Aurelio's door, and she had answered in 30 seconds, and she had said, "I was worried you weren't coming." She had said it the way people say things that have been running in their minds, things they have been trying to keep small and manageable, but that come out when the moment that was making them worried finally resolves. She had been keeping the worry small. She had been in her warm house in her cardigan and her wool socks, watching the storm through the window, managing the distance between what she needed and whether it was going to arrive. He had said I was always coming. He meant it in the specific and the general. He meant it about that morning that wrote that package. He also meant it in the way that 11 years of reliable arrival means something that the driver who shows up during the ice storm is not a coincidence or an exceptional event, but is the expression of a commitment that has been made and remade every morning for 11 years, and that on this particular morning had been remade at 5:47 in a cold parking lot before the sun came up, before anything had happened to test it. The test had come. 38 minutes of it. He had sat in the cold and calculated and kept his hands where they were visible and asked a third time and waited for the call to be made and driven 400 feet when it was done. He had been always coming. The reprimand was entered into Burrows's personnel file on a Wednesday. She signed the acknowledgement form and returned it to the Office of Professional Standards. She completed the required training on emergency management protocols over the following month, a 4-hour course that included case studies from weather emergency incidents in other jurisdictions and a specific module on the handling of documented medical and essential delivery situations. She passed the course assessment. She returned to patrol. She had been a careful officer in most respects for 6 years. The incident on Birchmore Avenue did not define her career in the way that some incidents define careers. It was documented. It was in her file. It would be part of any future review of her performance as context and as record. Whether it changed the specific habits of professional practice that had produced the 38-minute delay, the habit of certainty without full verification, the deferral of the manifest review, the assumption that the hold could extend without cost, was a question that only time and subsequent conduct would answer. The investigation report noted the concern. The formal record noted it. What Burrows herself understood and changed was hers to know and hers to act on. The investigation's finding that she had exercised her authority with insufficient diligence was specific. It did not use the language of bias or prejudice. It described what happened operationally and identified where the professional judgment had been inadequate. This specificity was intentional. The Office of Professional Standards operated in the language of documented conduct, not inference, and it was also, in its way, a limitation. It named the 38 minutes, but not the full weight of what the 38 minutes contained. It named the amber strip, but not what the amber strip meant to a woman on a fixed income managing her insulin supply through a mail-order pharmacy, because that was what her coverage made possible. The investigation record was complete within its scope. The scope had boundaries. Joanne Park had read the investigation report when it was released. She had noted the finding and the reprimand. She had filed it. She had then gone back to her regular work, the scheduling, the routing, the manifest preparation, the coordination with facilities and individuals who depended on delivery. She had not expected the investigation to be larger than it was. She had expected it to produce a formal record and a protocol change, and it had produced both. That was what the process was designed to produce. She was a practical woman. She accepted practical outcomes while understanding their limits. The County Emergency Management Protocol clarification was circulated to all Millbrook Police Department patrol officers, to the fire department, to the school district, and to all registered emergency medical delivery contractors in the county. It was a 2-page document, specific and practical, written in the language of operational procedure. It described exactly how emergency travel authorizations would be communicated during future declared emergencies. It established the mobile data terminal requirement. It assigned responsibility to the police department's operations coordinator for ensuring the terminal updates were executed within 1 hour of any authorization being issued. Joanne Park received a formal acknowledgement from the County Emergency Management Coordinator. The acknowledgement thanked the company for its cooperation during the storm, for its preparation of the medical delivery manifest, and for filing the incident report that had prompted the protocol clarification. It was a professional letter written in the measured language of government correspondence, and it said exactly what it needed to say without embellishment. Joanne filed it in the company's emergency operations documentation folder, She added a note to the company's own internal protocol review flagging the communication gap as a point to address in future emergency pre-deployment coordination. Raymond Chu posted the newspaper article on the depot break room wall for a week, then took it down. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. The 3 drivers who had worked the storm day had all seen it. They had read it with the particular attention of people who know the inside of a story that is being told from the outside, who can see the gap between the article's surface and the specific textured reality that the article's word count could not contain. They had said very little about it to each other. There was a kind of understanding in that silence. Antonio Ferris had said on the day the article ran they got the main thing right. He meant the deliveries. He meant the medical supplies and the homebound patients and the 3 drivers who had shown up. He meant that the article had identified correctly what the essential element of the day's story was. The stop and the delay were in there as context, but they were not the center. The center was the deliveries. Dontae had said, yeah, he had meant it. The center was the deliveries. The center was always the deliveries, not as an abstraction, not as a proof of anything about himself or about the job, but as the practical concrete matter of a manifest that listed specific people with specific needs and a set of routes that connected the depot to their doors. The manifest was a document of dependency. Each address a person who was depending on arrival. Each code a category of need. He had read that dependency into the manifest when he studied it the night before the storm, and he had carried it with him through the morning, through the loading dock and the cold parking lot, and the iced streets, and the 38-minute stop, and the 400-foot drive to 1402 Birchmore Avenue. He had knocked. She had answered. He had placed the package in her hands. That was the job. That was what 11 years looked like. That was what showing up in the storm meant reduced to its most essential form: a knock-and-open door, a package placed in waiting hands, the worry that had been kept small finally released. Mrs. Aurelio called her doctor's office the morning after the storm, as Dontae had advised. The nurse she spoke with consulted the pharmacist about the temperature strip reading and the duration of the cold exposure. The pharmacist confirmed that the amber zone reading for the documented duration was within the manufacturer's usability window. The insulin was safe to use. The nurse passed this information to Mrs. Aurelio, who wrote it on the notepad she kept by the phone and who said thank you with a specificity that suggested she had been worrying about it. She used the insulin on schedule. She noted in her own log a small notebook she had been keeping for 3 years, tracking her daily medications and readings. The record of a careful woman managing her health with the seriousness it required, that the delivery had been delayed but had arrived within the usable window, and that the driver had specifically told her about the strip and advised her to call the doctor. She wrote, driver was thorough. She wrote, he drove in the storm. She wrote, I was glad when he knocked. Harold Vesey did not keep a medication log, but his daughter did as part of the spreadsheet she maintained for his multiple prescriptions, dosage schedules, refill dates, contact information for each prescribing physician. She entered the blood pressure medication's delayed arrival date and noted the reason. She entered Dontae's name, which she had gotten from his delivery ID badge when he handed over the package. She entered it under the column she had labeled notes. What she wrote was showed up during the ice storm. Blood pressure medication 3 days delayed by storm. Hand delivered. She did not delete it. It remained in the spreadsheet as a fact about a specific day. Dontae did not know about these records. He did not know about Mrs. Aurelio's notebook or Mr. Vesey's daughter's spreadsheet. He had driven the route and delivered the packages and filed the formal account and gone home and gone to work the next day. The private records that other people kept of his arrival were not visible to him, as most of the consequences of our ordinary faithful actions are not visible to us. They exist in the changed conditions of other people's lives, logged in their private notebooks and spreadsheets and memories felt in the relief of a worry resolved. This is the nature of the work he had been doing for 11 years. It was consequential in ways that were mostly invisible to him, not in the way of dramatic hidden influence, but in the ordinary daily way that reliable delivery of the things people need is consequential. Someone had their medication. Someone had their medical supplies. Someone had the thing that the address on the package said they needed delivered by a person who had understood what he was carrying and had driven carefully and had knocked the right way. These consequences did not report back to the depot. They lived in other people's days in the uninterrupted maintenance of their health and daily function that good delivery made possible. He had been producing these consequences for 11 years. They were his record, as real as the delivery log and more durable than any incident report. Mrs. Aurelio's notebook entry driver was thorough. He drove in the storm. I was glad when he knocked was a private document. It was not going anywhere. It was not going to be cited in a news article or submitted to the Office of Professional Standards. It was the record of a 79-year-old woman noting in the notebook she kept to manage her health that on a specific morning in an ice storm, a driver had shown up and had told her what she needed to know about her medication. It was the kind of record that exists in thousands of private notebooks and notes apps and memory accumulated across 11 years of a man doing his job well, in the specific daily way that good work accumulates into a life. What he knew was what he had done. He knew the manifest. He knew the strip had gone amber. He knew he had filed the account and the protocol had changed and the medications had been delivered. He knew he had been on Birchmore Avenue 400 feet from a homebound patient's door for 38 minutes in the cold. He also knew what she had said when he knocked. He carried that forward. It was not a reward exactly. It was not the reason he did the job. The job existed for its own reasons, and he had been doing it before he ever met Mrs. Aurelio. But it was something that a 38-minute wait in the cold on a morning when the city had mostly decided not to move could not take away from him. It was the particular knowledge that the thing he had driven through the storm to do had mattered to a specific person, not in the abstract, in the precise particular weight of a package placed in waiting hands. He drove his route the following week when the ice was gone and the streets were clear and the city had returned to its ordinary rhythm. He drove Birchmore Avenue at his usual speed in his usual lane position with his usual attention to the subtle crossfall on the east end that new drivers sometimes did not notice. He drove past 1402. He did not stop. It was not on his manifest that day. He noted the house as he passed it the way a person notes a landmark that has acquired meaning not with sentimentality, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the place is part of a record that the person carries. He drove to his first stop of the day. He got out of the van. He picked up the package. He walked to the door and knocked. The route ran through the east side in its ordinary winter configuration. The ice from the storm had melted. The yards were showing their brown grass, and the trees were bare, and the light was the particular pale blue light of a Millbrook winter morning when the sky is clear and the air still carries a residual cold that the sun has not yet reached. He moved through it with the unhurried efficiency of a man in his domain, someone who knows the streets and the houses and the rhythm of the work so well that the work does not require effort in the way unfamiliar work requires effort. It required attention, which he gave it. It required care, which he brought. It did not require him to think about where he was going, because where he was going was already part of him. He passed 1402. He noted it. He kept moving. He delivered to 11 addresses that day. He helped one woman carry a large appliance box to her back door because she was alone in the house, and the box was awkward for one person to manage at a doorstep. He waited at one address for 6 minutes because the occupant needed extra time to come to the door, and he could see through the window that she was moving, that she was coming. He left a note at one address where no one answered with the depot's phone number and his route number, and a note that said, "Will attempt redelivery tomorrow, a.m." He signed it with his first name. He got back to the depot at 2:20. He turned in his log. He sat in the break room for 12 minutes. He drove home. This is the shape of work that the world requires but does not always see. It is performed before the sun comes up in cold parking lots by people who have read the manifest and understood what it contains and have decided that what it contains is reason enough to go. It does not require a storm to give it meaning. The meaning was already there in the codes on the page, in the addresses, in the human reality behind each designation. But the storm made it visible in a way that ordinary days do not. The storm reduced the city to its essentials, removed the covering noise of the everyday, and made clear which actions and which people were holding the essential functions together when everything else had slowed or stopped. 3 drivers at the depot. 16 packages on the manifest. 2 RX designations at the top of the route. 1 amber strip and 1 door opened within 30 seconds of the knock. The storm also made visible something that the ordinary days had been concealing, or rather not concealing, because it was never hidden, only unremarked. What was unremarked in the ordinary course was the specific vulnerability of the people at the end of the medical and pharmaceutical deliveries. These were people who could not come to the depot to pick up their own packages. They could not send a neighbor in the storm. They could not drive to the pharmacy when the roads were closed. They were dependent not as a condition of weakness, but as a condition of age and illness and circumstance on a chain of transportation and logistics that most people had no reason to think about until the chain was stressed and they could see where it was thin and where it held. The storm stressed the chain. The 3 drivers who showed up were where it held. This was the meaning of the manifest, not as a document, but as a thing, as a record of dependency, a map of people who needed arrival, a list of addresses whose residents were counting on the chain not breaking on this particular day in this particular ice storm. Dontae had read that meaning into the manifest the night before. He had carried it with him. He had been 38 minutes late because of something that had nothing to do with the road or the packages or the people waiting, but he had arrived. The chain had held. The storm passed. The city resumed. The essential work went back to being invisible in the way that essential work usually is present, relied upon, rarely examined until something disrupts it, and the disruption makes the reliance apparent. What remained was what had already been true before the storm. Dontae Marcus Ellison had been doing this job for 11 years with the full weight of his attention and ability, delivering things that mattered to people who needed them, knowing his roots and his packages and his responsibility in a way that expressed itself not in statements but in performance day after day, in every season, in every condition. The record of this was not primarily in the incident report or the newspaper article or the formal reprimand or the protocol clarification, though all of those were real documents in a real archive and they would remain there. The record was in 11 years of on-time arrivals and 0 accidents, in the fact that Raymond Chu had known without asking why Dontae had come to work that morning when 24 other drivers had not. The record was in the manifest, which Dontae had arranged himself to prioritize the time-sensitive packages, and in the route which he had driven with the care the icy roads required, and in the delivery log which he had filled out with the precision of a man who understood that the log was a document of accountability. The record was in the amber strip and his decision to tell Mrs. Aurelio about it, and in the conversation with Raymond in the break room, and in the formal incident account, filed in careful, specific language that afternoon. It was also in the sentence he had said on the doorstep of 1402 Birchmore Avenue. That sentence was not in any filing. It was not in any record. It existed in the memory of a 79-year-old woman who had written a few lines about it in her notebook and who had used her insulin on schedule because someone had driven through the ice storm to bring it to her door. It existed in the specific, unrepeatable moment of a knock answered, and a package placed in waiting hands, and a worry resolved. These were the true records of a life of reliable work. They lived where such records always live, in the changed conditions of the people who had been waiting. He had been always coming. The storm was not what made that true. The storm was just the morning when it became a sentence he said out loud. Subscribe our channel if these are the stories you come here to find. We will keep telling them. There are people at work in the world right now who know the weight of what they carry and who carry it anyway in the cold toward someone waiting behind a door.